Hey everybody. A few days ago I talked about emergent stories as something that you can try and approach on purpose. You can let the players define which sorts of contexts they would like to see more often and in what connections, and sort of work with the player to create the emergent stories they'd like to see. But today I'd like to talk about the other side of the coin, which accomplishes the same thing, but is exactly the opposite approach. This is the idea that you can handcraft stories that are emergent. That might sound strange, right? Handcrafted emergent stories? What the heck are you talking about? Well, I'll give you an example. You're playing Dwarf Fortress or whatever your favorite, fortress-like game is, right? And you've built yourself this really cool fortress, and in come the goblins. The goblins are a handcrafted emergent story. The dev didn't generate goblins from their base elements and, simulate out this and that and the other thing. No, the dev said between 8 and 12 goblins attack you and you have this many people in your fortress. And that's enough to create an emergent story because the goblins behave according to a set of algorithms that interacts with your core play, which is constructing the base. So the goblins run up to your front entrance. If you have correctly built your base and you have a front entrance that they'll run up to. Otherwise, they'll go around and just sneak in the back, right? And then when they're at your front entrance, they'll smash their way through. They'll kill your guards, whatever. They'll enter into your inner chamber here and get routed around one of your walls, and then they'll break into your core base and start killing off your civilians. And the idea here is that you are responsible for turning this into a story. The player is responsible for turning this into a story by building a facility, by staffing it, by having people in these places to prevent this sort of thing from getting out of hand, by choosing exactly where to route how many different kinds of enemies. It's something where there is an algorithm, but behind the algorithm is an artisanal seed, a handcrafted seed. Goblins have this many hit points. Goblins can carry these kinds of weapons. Goblins come in this kind of formation with this kind of different combat class setup. That's the same sort of thing that I'm talking about. But the big difference is I want the player to be able to choose. I don't want the player to always get attacked by random enemies. I don't want the player to have to just survive whatever you throw at him. I don't want the player to always randomly get sick. I don't want the player to always randomly have characters throw tantrums. I don't want anything to happen always randomly. I want the player to be able to choose what kind of enemies they face and build for that kind of experience. And by enemies, I'm not even talking about enemies. I'm just talking about the experience of choosing what kind of story seeds you want to encounter. So let's go and give you an example. You're playing Kerbal. Kerbal is a game about building spaceships, Kerbal Space Program. So you build yourself a rocket and you fly off to the moon, or you fly off to the other moon, or you fly off to a planet or a planet's moon. This is the basic idea. The core play of Kerbal is in traveling. You build your ship, and then you have succeeded in your mission when you successfully land wherever you're trying to land. That is how the game works, and that is the joy of the game. But once you've landed, there is nothing to do. The joy is in the travel, in arriving safely. Once you're actually on the surface, there's really nothing to do. Kerbal tries to get around this. They've added more and more features for what you can do on the surface of planets, mining and surface science and all that stuff. But there is no difference between landing on a planet or a moon or the furthest asteroid out in the depths of space. Once you're on the surface, your new expanded play is all going to be the same as any other planet anywhere. That's not very good. So what can you do about that? Well, you can go with the approach of making the planets as different as possible. So the No Man's Sky approach. So you've got like a McDonald's planet, and then you've got like a mushroom planet, and then you've got like a, giant broken planet. But that is also very limited because those sorts of interfaces, those sorts of cues don't really hit the player very hard unless they really want to stay for quite a while. And most players don't. Most players are fine just visiting and doing whatever they came to do and then leaving. So what can you do? Well, you can go with the more successful route, which is the Outer Wilds approach, where all of the planets have their own characteristics, right? They're all handcrafted and have their own characteristics. But the fun thing about this is the characteristics are not random and they're not terrain based. They certainly involve terrain and they can feel random, but these are all stories. When you visit one of the planets, you're there to solve something. You're there to figure out what's going on. You're not there to land and explore exactly. You're going to, but you're doing it for a reason. And this is the key. Each of these planets is a handcrafted, artisanal story element, whereas the ones in No Man's Sky are just randomly generated. But this is also not quite what I want, because we're talking about a game where you're building a spaceship, and the point is that how you build the spaceship should matter. None of these stories really have anything to do with the spaceship you're on. I mean, there might be some like gating going on where you must have a certain module or whatever, but this isn't really a game that's about building the perfect spaceship. It's a game about exploring the strange universe. But we can go ahead and handcraft artisanal emergent stories that actually do have something to do with your spaceship. For example, what if every time you decide that you're going to go land on the moon, there is a story beat where you get hit by micrometeorites or whatever, hit by debris. And the function, and the function there is simply that half your tanks get punctured. And then you've got to scramble to try and figure out how much you can rescue before it evaporates, how much is still intact, what you can do. And this happens every single time you go to the moon. Just randomly, half your tanks get hit by debris. Solving this is a mechanical problem. It's something where you have to build your ship specifically to weather this kind of damage. And if you were going to go to Mars or Jupiter, that's not going to be a factor. You're not going to have to worry about it unless you plan to stop by the moon first. Or after, I guess. So what I'm saying here is that you can build these stories. So if you leave from the moon and go to somewhere else, you're going to have to deal with their story after you deal with the hit by debris story. And so you can have the player handcraft their own experience. It's not just how do they build their ship and how do they respond to the debris and how do they respond to the emergencies. It's also what sort of story are they trying to tell? Where are they going? Because they're opting into these stories when they go to these places. So you allow them to choose what kind of story seeds they are engaging with. And they build whatever they're building specifically to deal with the stories that they plan to engage with. The stories themselves are handcrafted seeds, but they're not like scripted. They're not going to be beat A happens, beat B happens, beat C happens. Instead, they happen based on algorithms, in the same way that attacking goblins follow their own pathing algorithms, their own attack algorithms, their own spot checks and stuff like that. In the same way, this sort of thing happens. You can say that when you visit, when you go and visit Mars, it's a far-off planet, right? So it's got a challenging story. And the story for Mars is something like, one of your Kerbals goes rogue and tries to kill off all your other Kerbals and return home with only him having access to this science because he's working with evil Kerbals. And I'm using Kerbal. Obviously, this isn't Kerbal Space Program anymore. We're talking about a completely theoretical game. But the core idea here is that you don't have to script how that rogue Kerbal behaves. All you have to do is write a story where you select a Kerbal, and then you make them the actor as a hunter. So all you do is you turn one of the Kerbals into a hunter, and you can restrict it to specific categories of Kerbal if you'd like, or whatever. But the basic idea is you simply assign a new behavior to one of the Kerbals, and that Kerbal behavior is to have them hunt down all of the other members aboard the ship, which will depend on their physical characteristics and whether they're smart enough to do things like try and vent things into space. But Make Hunter isn't something that only applies to Kerbal. You could make the AI program into a hunter. You could make a random alien that's arrived on the ship into a hunter. You could have it be something that's on the planet's surface. So these are algorithms which have a wide applicability. In the same way that there's no difference in terms of the algorithm between a goblin attack and a tiger attack and a giant elder Shoggoth attack, they all have the same basic ideas as to how an attack should go. The difference is their stats and some of their characteristics. It's not about programming them for a specific story. It's not about giving them each individual coding. It's all about making sure that you have elements that can be processed against how the player plays. So in this case, if you've got a hunter, then you have to have a way to defend against a hunter. It has to be fun to defend against a hunter. And the way you would do that in a ship-based game is you would have the ship's various construction elements, like, for example, they might have some crew quarters and stuff, right? You might have a little bit of security or safety measures built in. So you might be able to seal the bulkheads, but, that's weight. Adding in bulkheads is more mass. Or you might have emergency measures. So here's like an emergency suit. But that, again, is also mass, and it takes up internal space. So do you want that? I mean, it can certainly help your people survive if someone vents the oxygen, and there's thousands of reasons why that might happen. But maybe that's not worth the risk. Maybe you program the bulkhead so that only certain Kerbals can get through. And that means that if the rogue Kerbal is stuck on one side of the bulkhead, they're going to have to figure out some way to get across, whether that's hacking the bulkhead or maybe an EVA across or something. And in that time, the player will hopefully see that the rogue Kerbal is doing rogue Kerbal things. This is the basic idea here is you want the player's play to be able to interact with whatever algorithms your stories rely on. Because that's what creates the emergent play. It's not the fact that there is a story. It's the fact that the player can interact with the story. That's what makes it emergent. The seed of the story doesn't become a story until it is pushed through whatever the player is doing. And I thought this was worth talking about. You can allow this kind of thing to be quite diverse depending on how deep you want to go, how complex you want to make things. Another example might be you could have disease as a factor, so your Kerbal could get sick. And you can have a random Kerbal get sick, and then, how long will it be before people notice? How many more people will get infected? Well, that depends. Did you install a medical station? Do you have a monitor? Do you have like a doctor on board that's monitoring the health of your crew? Hopefully the doctor on board that's monitoring the health of your crew wasn't the rogue agent from the last story you did, because you're doing a 2-part mission. There's a lot of other things you could do. For example, the disease idea doesn't have to be just, this is specifically a disease. It can be like a progression, and you can have it have arguments that you can pass it. So the disease progression would be like, you get sicker and then you die, but on the route you infect other people. Whereas a different setup might be, you go space crazy and you can't handle it anymore, and you start to run around the ship and just mess things up on the inside of the ship. You could have the same basic idea, except for instead of infecting others, the action would be smash stuff. And you could even use this for something like pregnancy, because the action would be, instead of at the end, you don't die, you just give birth to whatever thing is defined as, your baby. So this whole setup is quite flexible as long as you know what you're planning to do with it and how the player is going to interact with it with their gameplay. I think that's it. Let me know if you understood it or didn't understand it, because I'm sort of being a little bit fast and loose with these videos. Have a nice weekend.